Hi, this is Misha, and a few of you have asked for us to do some more Mosin-Nagant videos, and so I had one come in here, or actually a couple of these, last month. So I wanted to talk about really the rarest M44 Mosin-Nagant Carbine. This was made in Romania by Cugir or Cugir or Cugir or Cugir or Cugir. Everyone thinks they seem to know how to pronounce it correctly. The funny thing is they pronounce it differently. So could it possibly be it's a tomato thing where there's a few different correct pronunciations? Anyway, this is by the production numbers, one of the least common, and also in America, one of the least common. And before we get to this, I wanted to talk about M44 production and use outside of Russia. Now we have a video or two talking about the M44 in Russia, how it was developed from the M38 carbine. The M44 was essentially an M38 with a bayonet attached permanently. This is a side folding spiker. Very, very similar to the spike bayonet on the standard 9130, but a little easier to get on and off the barrel, I think you would agree. The M38 carbine was essentially made to be, well, a carbine for specialists, artillery crews, recon units. The M44, though, ended up being for general issue. The M38 was so popular that in 1943 they did a test batch of 50,000 M38s with bayonets. They liked them so well, they adopted them as a standard to replace the 9130 infantry rifle in 1944. So this was the standard gun in Russia at the end of the Great Patriotic War, World War II. 9130 production would be over by 45, and the M44 would be built in Russia from 43 through 48, mostly at Izhevsk, but briefly at Tula as well. And it would remain the standard until really it was replaced by both the SKS and AK-47. It was really the last issued pattern of the Mosin in Russia, and it was the first carbine that Russia adopted for general issue. By carbine, we mean we have a 20.5-inch barrel, so we are significantly shorter, a foot shorter than the original 91, and we're still 3/4 of a foot shorter than the 9130. Now, because of this bayonet assembly, actually weight-wise, we're about the same, so we're not really saving on weight, it's more of a length thing. So yeah, though Russia started to, well, they stopped production in 1948, and a lot of, years like 1946 are pretty darn uncommon. They didn't make that many because they had tons of guns left over after the war. And of course, they kept them in service for about a decade more, but really it was on the way out. But since Russia was building the Com Bloc at the time, which became the Warsaw Pact, they sold and then gave away the production line for the M44 to several friendly nations, as well as just giving guns. This is a great example of a gun given to an ally. This is a 1944 Russian, but it's a 1950s or 60s Yugoslavian refurbishment, as evidenced by markings on the stock. Right here. Kind of neat. What they did in Yugoslavia, they essentially sanded the stocks and then redid them, oil finished them, and sometimes they reblued them, sometimes they didn't. This is a refurbishment, but it's different from the typical Russian refurbishment. It's kind of neat, I thought. So when this one came in, what I really liked about it, it still has the unprotected rear swivel. You can see where it's kind of worn down here because there's no escutcheon in the metal. You can see the front has a small escutcheon on the bottom. This is because the wood gets thin here because of the cleaning rod, so you have to have some metal here. This, though, did not. Now later, most of your Russian guns you find today, of course, are refurbished, and they would add these in the stock. This has typical war features. We've got the high wall receiver here. And we've got the earlier style of front sight, the slim front sight base and bayonet housing here. A few differences like that. So yeah, Yugoslavia never made M44s, but they refurbished and made them their own. But many other countries did make theirs. Now, a late pattern Russian gun would have a few differences. We have a scallop in the receiver here. Save on weight, and I think cosmetically it's just appealing. This, as you see, has metal reinforcement in the sling slot here. They did that post-war in Russia too, for strength. And this has the thicker front sight base and housing up here. Again, done late in Russia, I'm sure for strength, and also maybe it was easier to machine. Okay, so who made it outside of Russia? Well, one of my favorites, but I don't have at the moment. If I do, it'll pop in a video, I'm sure, is Poland. We know we like Polish guns around here. They adopted the M44 as the WZ-44 and put it in production sometime in the late 40s and through the very early 50s. They didn't produce it that long because they were already interested in the AK by 1954 and the SKS, although they dropped the SKS. But they did make them at the Circle 11, the Luxnick Radom factory, and the Polish guns have extremely high quality bluing and machining. I'll tell you a story about that at the end of the video. Another country that made them was Hungary, FEG. They would adopt it as the 48M, and they would actually make both the 9130 rifle in small numbers and the M44. And again, they didn't make them very long. They seemed to have really abandoned production by the mid-50s, if not even earlier. I've seen a few different dates, that's why I'm not being very specific. Some say this, some say that. Of course, another famous producer who did make them in large numbers was China. It was adopted as the Type 53. Went into production that year, or perhaps the next, and would be produced in the millions. They made a lot of them. Outside of Russia, there is probably more made in China. And then finally, Romania, which is actually one of our last to put these critters into production. They also adopted these in 1953 as the M53, produced at the Cugir Arsenal. That year, production was quite low. 54 and 55, it was a little higher. But they never made that many. Whereas most nations like Hungary and Poland made hundreds of thousands, China and Russia made them in the millions, Romania only made about 70,000, maybe, a little less. We don't really know exact numbers, but we're going off what researchers have come up with, and 70,000 seems to be a good guesstimate. And really only over about a 2.5, maybe even just 2-year time period, because by 1956, they were making the M56 SKS, and by 1963 they were making their version of the AKM, the PM63. So they rapidly modernized at that time. And of course, originally most of these nations would receive guns from Russia. Others, like Yugoslavia, would modify. A good example is in Czechoslovakia, they would have the so-called 9138. These were cut down long rifles to M38 pattern. And there's also the 9159, which is pretty famous in America because of how many were imported. Some people attribute these guns to Russia, and more people attribute them to Bulgaria. Honestly, over the years, people have gone back and forth on the story of the 9159. We'll make that another video. But it's another cut-down rifle, the carbine, but without bayonet, although sometimes it's in M44 stocks. Easy way to tell an M44 stock from an M38, just so you know, is the M44 has this cutout, of course, for the bayonet. The M38 would not. Also, in my experience, M44 stocks tend to be a little thicker in the wrist and the groove area. But that is just my own personal observation. Romanian quality, the ballooning was very nice. Not quite as nice as Polish, but I would honestly say probably better than Russian. Of course, they were producing at peacetime, so they could afford to be very nice. And more importantly, they're just rare. Now, a funny story. Back in the 90s, Mosins weren't common like they have become. Really, the ones we had were mostly from Eastern Europe and Finland. The Russian stockpiles, Ukrainian stockpiles really hadn't hit yet. So when the first M44s came in, aside from a few from Finland, you got essentially Romanian, Hungarian, and Polish. And even back then, the Polish were valued a little more. I remember very clearly going into a store, the Romanian and the Hungarian were $90 for very nice condition. Polish in the same condition was $110. So even back then, they valued the Polish a little more. Now what's funny is those were everywhere for, as you see, a very reasonable price around the turn of the millennium, and then they disappeared. So it seems like with the FEG, Cugir, and Radom guns, they had one big import batch, but then that was it. Once they stopped importing them, they were gone. And then the Russian guns came in. And it was funny because we all had kind of wanted the Russians and we were excited. But you never know what you have until it's gone. Once the new had worn off the Russian guns, we all kind of lamented not being able to get more Hungarians, Polish, and Romanian. This is how it goes. Now, funnily enough, at that time, when either of those came in, Chinese were still quite rare, so Type 53s, even ratty ones, were bringing good money. But then Century imported a giant batch of those out of, I think it was Albania, Armenia, or somewhere a few years back, and then the price on Type 53s went down. It just goes to show you the surplus market. Alright, well I just thought we would show a couple of M44s that walked in and talk about the production. Of course, most of these were just made and put up in storage, but some are used by revolutionaries, and quite a few appeared in Vietnam and Korea. If you're interested in Mosins, please do check out our other videos. If you like this one, we'd appreciate a like click. Also, if you haven't subscribed, we'd appreciate that. And if you really want to help support us, please check out our Patreon page. This is Misha, and we will catch you next time.